Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special meeting of the Children and Young People Standing Select Committee. I'd like to welcome and say Happy New Year to you all. I'm glad that we've got some member observers this afternoon so that committee is not outnumbered by officers. And thank you to the officers for getting back into the swing of talking to us elected members so quickly after the return from your holidays. And I hope you all had a smashing Christmas and New Year as well. As is our normal practice, if we could just introduce ourselves and going round in order. And I'll kick off by saying that I'm Martin Grocott. I'm the County Councillor for the Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny, and I chair this committee.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny Manager.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Good afternoon, Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People.
Kath Saunders, Governance Manager, Children and Young People.
Richard Jones, Performance Manager.
Sean Schofield, Data Analyst.
Jane Rogers, Head of Children's Services.
Good afternoon, Julie Boothroyd, Chief Officer, Safeguarding Social Care and Health.
Leanne Wakely, I'm the Chair of the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors.
Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castle Ward and Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Pete Strong, National Education Union.
Tudor Thomas, County Councillor for Priory Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
David Jones, member for the Criconi Ward and a member of this committee.
Hello, I'm Penny Jones and I'm Cabinet Member for Social Services, Safeguarding and Health.
Val Smith, Lambaddock Ward, Observing.
There we are. Thank you very much indeed. One or two lights didn't come on there, and I'm not sure that we've picked everybody up. So despite the improvements that were supposed to have been made in here, maybe you have to still jab really hard on the button to get your light on. But if you could just check when you start to speak that your light is on, that would help live streaming enormously. Thank you very much. A welcome to our Cabinet Member, Penny Jones. It's always a pleasure to see Cabinet members here. We will still talk about you as opposed to stabbing you in the back if you're here. So welcome, and you're always welcome at our committee, Councillor Jones. The first item then is apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillors Brown, Woodhouse, Laura Jones and Mr Fowler.
Item 2 is declarations of interest. Oh, sorry. Many of us this afternoon, in the light of the report on school that involves school governance, will have to declare interests as school governors. I am Chair of Governors at Llantilio Patholi Primary and also a member of the governing body of King Henry VIII in Abergavenny. Councillor Powell.
And I am a Governor at King Henry VIII, Abergavenny.
I'm the Chair of Governors at Trellick Primary School.
I'm on the governing body of Ysgol Gymraeg Efenni in Abergavenny.
And I'm on the governing body at Ysgol Gymraeg Efenni and at Criconi School as well.
Right, yeah, and in relation to item 6, I need to point out that I'm actually employed at Caldicot Comprehensive School, albeit in a very junior capacity as part-time exam invigilator, 0 hours contract. So I don't think it has any real pecuniary interest or whatever.
Thank you, Chair. Governor of Derry View and Llantilio Patholi Primaries.
So if people could remember to fill in their declaration of interest form and hand it to Richard here at the end of the meeting, please. Moving on then to item 3, bearing in mind that means that because this is a special meeting, we have no minutes to consider and approve. So we're straight into the meat of today's business. And I'd like to ask for the report on the 6 monthly scrutiny of the performance of our children's social services.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief introduction before handing over to the Head of Children's Services. This is, as we've discussed, a Q2 roundup of children's services performance for 2018-19. The data comprises of the performance framework introduced with the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, as well as some local relevant information. Just to be clear, Welsh Government published Wales level averages and quartile data for 2017-18 for the quantitative measures, but qualitative benchmarking was not included in this publication. So I'll hand over now to Jane Rogers, Head of Children's Services, for her take on the performance.
Thanks, Sian and Chair. I'm not going to say too much. You'll have all had opportunity to read the report, but I just wanted to draw a couple of key points. Overall, the report reflects generally that the service is responding to increased numbers right across the service. That's from the numbers of contacts and inquiries coming through the front door, through to the numbers of children who are on the Child Protection Register and the number of children who Monmouthshire County Council is currently looking after. There's an increase of numbers right across those cohorts of children. But nevertheless, the service is maintaining and in some areas improving on some performance and key data indicators, which really I hope reflects the work that we've been doing as a service to improve on our systems and processes across the last really couple of years, and also to making sure that we've got the right individuals in place to really be responding well to those children and families who come our way. Nevertheless, as we always say in these situations, there's never room to be complacent within children's services, especially when we are facing a picture of increasing demands and in many instances increasing complexity with the families that we work with. So we really do have a continual development agenda within children's services. The children's services right across the entire service really does remain under constant development, monitoring, reviewing and adjusting to make sure that where we can continue to improve, we do, and that we are responding in the right way to families. With particular emphasis moving forward over the next period, we'll continue to be developing our family support services across the whole area of the windscreen of need, as we call it, particularly emphasis this period on implementing fully our Edge of Care team, which we've called ACT, Achieving Change Together, and our MIST team, which is working with some of our more complex children who we look after. So those are two particular aspects of the service, which over the next 6 to 12 months we should start to reap some of the dividends of making sure that we really do get those support services right for families. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Rogers. Who'd like to kick off with our questions? Peter.
Yeah, clearly one of the most significant parts in the report is the increase in the number of children on the Child Protection Register. I might have missed it in what you said, but is that because we're better at identifying those children, or is it because there are more children in need of protection?
It's the short answer is both of those things. Yeah, I mean, it's always so difficult to really fully understand and explain why you get sometimes these kind of quite stark variances in numbers, but it's for certain it's multifaceted. I think because we have got that, you know, we are doing really some focused work for families early on, that sometimes has the impact of kind of, you know, pushing something through when it needs to be. But we take that as a positive because it's really trying to kind of get that early identification of the real risks. So it's, you know, we do have a picture of increasing complexity within our communities, within Monmouthshire. One of the reasons we kind of really, you know, that really tells us that is that when we've had an increased number of contacts on that front door, but because we're getting that kind of early advice and guidance, you know, much more robust, we have less children actually coming through into the system. But those children that do come through tend to be more complex, with some, you know, harder, more vulnerable issues really to kind of to deal with. So I mean, it's, you know, it's not a bad thing at all. We don't take it as a bad thing. It's something that we really have to understand and take account of, that we have those increasing numbers, say, of children on the register. But it does mean that we are identifying those children and getting the right care and support planning around them.
Councillor Powell.
Yes, I was going to say, in this context, are there more children that have extra complex needs than the normal looking after children, in proportion to all the children altogether? Is that rising, that more of the children have got extra needs and more complex needs than used to be?
It's difficult to kind of give you a really clear answer, but our general feeling is that the children who do come through into the system, so who come onto the Child Protection Register or who require looked after services, as a general feeling is that there tends to be more complexity within those family networks, and some of that kind of impact of generational issues kind of really coming through. So children who do come into that kind of more statutory end tend to stay longer. There tends to be more complexity. But it's, you know, to really quantify that and give you really hard, clear facts around that is difficult. It's just a sense that we get from, you know, knowing the families that we work with really well, and also some of the data does bear that out.
Can I just ask again, do you find that when they're taken away from the home where they were really in problems, that just even coming away from there and coming into perhaps a more calm situation, that the improvement, you can see improvement already, or does that take an awful long time?
Sadly, it does take an awful long time, and some children who've been exposed to, you know, adverse situations in their early years or haven't had those opportunities to develop really strong attachments, or those have been interrupted, can take many years in some cases to recover from trauma. But, you know, the quicker that we can get services in, and the more specialist services that we can put in, which really, over the last, you know, 10, 15 years, we've been becoming so much more aware of things like response to trauma, attachment difficulties, you know, and the more finely attuned we can make our services to meet those needs of children coming into our care, the better, really. But sadly, it does take a long time.
We must thank all of you and everybody that's involved for their dedication, because without that, and they must have marvellous patience, without that help, where would they be? So we thank all the people that are involved.
I'm very grateful for that note of thanks. And I must say that at the heart of this for Monmouthshire, it's our foster carers. Greatest asset.
Thank you for that, Councillor Powell, and thank you, Ms Rogers, as well. I know the department's worked hard at getting more foster parents, and I hope it's beginning to pay dividends now. So, point well made by both of you. Thanks. Any other comments? Councillor Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just sort of pursue some of the reasons for children becoming looked after? I'm from a background in education, so I'm aware of some of them. And is there any evidence to suggest that today's looked after children some of them are children of people who were, or parents who were themselves looked after children in their childhood. If I make myself clear there, I'm not sure.
We do have, you know, children who are in our current care system who've had parents who've also had experiences either of being looked after themselves or, you know, have been in receipt of services, social services as children themselves. That is true to say, but I wouldn't be able to tell you numbers, but that's absolutely true to say. And when we're doing our assessments of children and their families, it's one of those things that we really try to look into in some depth. Is the parents' experience of their own childhood.
Councillor Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Just to ask, obviously, you know, the trend in one way is worrying that it is going up and that there are more children going into care. And obviously, it's a highly disruptive thing to happen in anyone's life. To be taken away from their own family and to have to go into foster care. And I can appreciate as Vice Chair of the Looked After Children Committee how much effort foster carers make and the service generally. But in Monmouthshire, are we on a par with other authorities in Wales, you know, comparable authorities, particularly sort of rural ones, or are the numbers higher or lower than other comparable authorities? Is it a national trend?
Sean or Richard may be able to answer this better than I, but I will have an initial go. So our looked after child rates are still low for, you know, across Wales, but then we've got a particular demographic in Monmouthshire. It's hard to get counties that are exactly, you know, you can do those kind of good comparisons with, but we're not, I don't think, too out of kilter with those ones that we do have comparisons drawn between us. The general trend across Wales is an increase of rate. Gwent particularly is a particular region in Wales where the rate is probably outstripped other regions. We have a particular, you know, there's again lots of reasons for that, but I mean, the impact of our judiciary within Gwent, within the Newport region, is one area that we kind of, you know, do pay particular interest in terms of really, you know, keeping our rates slightly higher than some of our neighbouring regions. But it's always multifaceted. In terms of our CP rates, you know, you'll know from the report that Monmouthshire has had that quite spike up, so that we are somewhat probably out of kilter with ourselves and with our comparative areas. So we've just kind of moved up. But it can be quite a temporary situation, that, and we do tend to see some fairly big jumps up and down in the figures. You'll see there's just charts. We tend to kind of go up in stages rather than a gradual increase, although the overall trend is upwards. I mean, and again, it's really difficult to explain, and it's not really a good thing or a bad thing in a way. It's just how it is. You know, those are the children on the register. I was just talking with Sean earlier, because sometimes if you've got some big sibling groups, that can really affect your numbers. So if we had a very, very quick look over, we've got at least 3 sibling groups of 4 children. So that takes a big chunk of your numbers, where if you had 117 individual families, that'd be one thing. But there won't be 117 families in there, and there is some quite big sibling groups that do kind of chunk out some of those that number, and that can really vary from month to the next. So you've actually, you know, your actual profile. But yeah, so general lack, we're probably, you know, in keeping. CP, we've just kind of come up in terms of rate.
Ms Schofield, is there anything you do want to add to that response?
No, I think that covers it. Our LAC numbers are traditionally and remain below the Welsh average. And as Jane says, our CP numbers have increased probably beyond the Welsh average at the moment.
Any further comments from members? Ms Rogers, don't think you've escaped yet. I have 3 questions for you, I'm afraid. The first is that your report shows that, yes, front door contacts have increased. Numbers on the Child Protection Register have increased. Referrals have increased. as an authority, do we have the resources to deal with this?
Thank you, Chair. Do you want to me to respond on that one, or did you want to ask the other?
I'll do them one at a time.
One at a time. That's a relief. Well, you know, somebody says, have you got enough resources? The answer is always going to be no, I'll have some more, please. But with that in mind, you know, we have got enough resources to respond to what comes through our front door. But it does have an implication in the sense that you're responding to priorities over here, as we have to. And it does mean that sometimes you can feel a little thin elsewhere. You know, you have to spread the resources that you've got. So any decisions over that will have implications. But you know, we meet our statutory responsibilities, we respond to where there is the highest need, we meet our, you know, the statutory demands that come through. So yes, in one sense, but always, you know, we always need more. And, you know, the longer our resources are tied up with those kind of higher end, more complex situations, you know, the slower it takes us to really get that turnaround, to drag those resources back into that front ends where we really want to get in early with families. So yes, but always implications.
Okay, that's good to know. I'd like to preface my second question by congratulating your staff on improving the number of assessments completed on time up to 90%. That really is a very considerable improvement since I first became chair of this committee. And I'd like it noted that I have spotted that and that I know that doesn't come without a lot of effort on behalf of staff. So congratulations there. But the second question is, and it really did stagger me from your report to read that a third of children receiving care and support have parents with mental health issues, and a quarter of them have parents who have problems with substance abuse. And so perhaps it's not surprising that their offspring find themselves with difficulties. And this is clearly a multi-agency issue. I wonder if you could give us some small detail. I know it's off the top of your head, but with figures like that, what steps are being taken to try to address difficulties like those wider family catastrophes almost in terms of working with other agencies?
Thanks, Chair. And I think, yes, some of the conversations we've been having here this afternoon in terms of complexity really does kind of bear that out. There's no child that really comes through into our services where there isn't some really, you know, quite difficult vulnerabilities within the parenting or the family environment. There isn't an easy answer, but all the services that we work with that, you know, support I should say, the process that really underpins the work that we do with children and families is very multi-agency in its focus. So we have, when children on the register, if there are mental health difficulties within the families, we quite often co-opt our adult mental health colleagues into the core group, which really kind of manages the care and support plan for a child on the register. And we also, that's just one example, really. Similarly, at that kind of early help, our Building Stronger Families team, you know, one of the main purposes of that team, as well as to do that direct with families, it's really to kind of coordinate and work closely with any other agencies that are involved with the parent or indeed the children or the family generally. So we really do have a very outward focus in terms of our interaction with other agencies. And of course, Children's Services is really one of the key partners around a couple of regional boards that really do look at this kind of wider interagency working. Certainly for us, it's the Children and Families Partnership Board, where we can really address issues that kind of go way beyond our area of prime concern, you know, so that real integration with health, that's where those conversations happen. And similarly, the South East Wales Safeguarding Children Board, you know, any interagency issues that are really affecting that child protection, child welfare landscape, we have a really good, well-trodden kind of route to have these discussions with our interagency colleagues.
Thank you very much. And my final question then, it's one that I can certainly relate to, because I've been doing some casework around a family where there is some kinship fostering. And I noticed that there's been a considerable increase in kinship fostering. But I'm slightly concerned, bearing in mind those figures for wider family issues, if a family member is caring for a looked after child. Could you reassure me about steps that are taken to assess the suitability of another member of the family looking after a looked after child rather than its parents?
Certainly, and when we talk about kinship foster carers, firstly I should say, where we can allow a child to remain within their own family and friend kind of network, we do so. But that's not to say that it isn't without its particular challenges and complexities. But in terms of being able to reassure you, if there is a kinship arrangement in place, that kinship carer does go through the same assessment process and panel process as a generic foster carer. Now, obviously, we take into account the very individual and particular needs and issues of that child, the family dynamics and the complexity that there can be in terms of being both a carer for a child and maybe a parent of a parent of that child. So all that forms part of our assessment to really make some very careful decisions around whether that arrangement is not just suitable but is actually the best option for that child.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. I'm declaring an interest. I am the council's member on the fostering panel. It's just been mentioned. I'd like to back up what Jane's just said.
Thank you very much. I'm sure Ms Rogers will be pleased to hear those comments. Any further contributions from committee? The recommendation in the report is, I think that we note that. And in summing up, again, thank you for bringing this report, both to Sian for compiling it and for service leaders for sharing with us some of the complexities of looking after children in Monmouthshire today. Thank you for reassuring us that at present the resources are there. And I think for giving us just a hint of the complexity of some of the work that you are doing with children in our community. I don't think there's anything specific that we would want to bring to the attention of our cabinet, other than perhaps to congratulate again all those who work so hard in the field in a very difficult area. And again, thank you for bringing the report to us this afternoon. So if we could move on then to agenda item 4, which is the South East Wales Adoption Services, and in so doing to welcome the service manager, Sue Radford, who joins us from Blaenau Gwent, who take the lead in this area. So for people watching on live streaming, just a moment while we change some personnel around, and welcome Sue. You're more than welcome this afternoon. So while Sue Radford is just getting her breath back and papers sorted out, this is agenda item 4. It is a report from the South East Wales Adoption Service. So over to you. Thank you very much, Ms Radford.
Thank you, Chair. I think my report sets out the scene, background and the sort of expectations of the National Adoption Service and COS. On page 2, I've highlighted sort of the national progress and COS progress, which, I think in the 4 years that COS has been in operation, it's shown a good improvement. I've mentioned on the top of page 3, I've mentioned the pressure areas, which I think the pressure areas are the same in adoption as in Wales in the moment as they are in fostering. That's going to be the same for the next couple of years, I think, although SEWIS are doing, they're doing better than some of the other regions in Wales at the moment. We've invested a lot in recruitment since the middle of last year, and it's starting to bear fruit in Q1 and Q2 of this year. I mean, I think the problem with recruitment at the moment is that we are sort of fishing from quite a small pond. My view is that we need to get the experience right. So right from the start, we're doing our assessments in a more timely manner. We've done a lot of work with panel so that adopters get a good experience when they come through panel. We put additional training in. We do have the added benefit of the psychology service input, which is sort of the envy of other regions in Wales. They do a lot of good work for us. And the middle of last year as well, I recruited a social worker, an additional social worker to do some direct work, which essentially is about preparing children and adopters for the placement of a child. That particular work is working really well, and at the end of January, I'm taking a request to the management board that we put some additional resource into that so that we can start preparing our children, for the move, because in previous years that wasn't completed. And I think generally, apart from that pressure, SEWIS are doing well. We're doing well in terms of placing children in a more timely manner and recruiting adopters and supporting them, and make sure when we get in that message that it's around lifelong support.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and it's good to hear the positives there as well. Committee, over to you. Any comments or questions? Well, Miss Radford, you've stunned them into silence. It doesn't happen very often.
I've never known that before.
You've probably already noted that I rarely let an opportunity pass to question an officer. It seems to me, from a position of some ignorance, I have to say, that over the years, the nature of adoption has changed. And when I was a young man, there were many more children coming for adoption, many of whom simply were children of their time before abortion was available, when people were put up for adoption rather than have a child before they were married, to put it bluntly. It seems to me that we've now moved very far away from that to a position where many of the children that come to be adopted are children with quite specific and special needs, and that they will not be easy youngsters to bring up within a conventional family way of bringing children up. You've slightly alluded to it, but I wonder if you could go perhaps just a little bit further about the way in which both the children and perhaps I'm more concerned about the parents, potential adoptive parents, and how they are selected, because obviously there is so much at stake for a child here, and the parents themselves have got so much staked in the adoption that if they were to adopt a child whose needs could not be met within that family, it would be a disaster. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about those very difficult to adopt children and how parents are chosen and supported.
Well, I think I've alluded to a little bit in my report, in that certainly the children that we are getting referred to the service in the last couple of years are more complex. They have a trauma history, and you can't just place those children without some sort of preparation work and without support. So the assessment process in itself is a very stringent process, and the assessing social worker will go through the criteria with the prospective adopters as to which child they think would better suit them and their family life. There's long conversations around that, and that reflects the assessment report. And then, secondly, the service holds a matching meeting. I have a team manager mainly, in the main, chairs those meetings, and those matching meetings take around 2 hours. I've chaired them myself. So again, that's a stringent process to make sure that we've got the right adopter for the child. And the children's social worker is invited along to that, and will have an input to that. And then eventually, panel have a say. Panel will have a say in whether that match is the right match for that child as well. So that's so that's basically what happens. Anything else?
No, that's fine. Just for committee, really, just to help us to appreciate the complexity of the work that you do. And obviously, it's yet another service done at a regional level, because each individual authority, I guess, would find it very difficult to provide a service on its own.
I think given the amount of children that are referred to the service at the moment, I think they would struggle. And the idea about a regional service is that it avoids a postcode lottery, and every child gets the best service that they can, really. So I think the regional service, since it's come into operation under the umbrella of the National Adoption Service, is working really well, because you have that oversight, and collectively all 5 regions have input into how we can improve the service.
Yes, Ms. I was going to say, would any of our own officers like to comment? Ms. Rogers.
Yes, to very much echo what Sue has said, the development of the regional approach has been of enormous benefit to Monmouthshire in terms of really driving up, standards and practice, and the overall understanding of the needs of adopted children and their parents. I think the one thing I would like to say, though, it is a regional service, but for each individual child that's coming through from a Monmouthshire referral, the decision, the ultimate decisions do come back into Monmouthshire. So we don't just kind of hand these children off to the regional service and off they go. It remains very much a partnership approach between the regional service and the individual local authorities. And any child who's adopted within Monmouthshire will come over my desk for my ultimate approval. So it's not just a kind of a handoff situation, it's very much a partnership one.
Thank you. Councillor Powell.
Yes, it's just a side question, really. I suppose it's difficult when you only got so many people willing to do adopting, but do try your best to put them with the families in a similar environment to what they've been used to having, or doesn't that come into it?
No, we do.
If they're a country person, or different types of places.
We do, Councillor Powell, yes. There's, that is all part and parcel of the matching criteria.
Yes,
really. The social worker will identify, the childcare social worker who knows the child best will make all those requests before the matching meeting takes place. So this is the sort of family I would like for this child. So yeah, it's taken into consideration every time we match. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to bring in our council, cabinet member, Councillor Penny Jones. Sorry, I can't get my teeth in this. Councillor Penny Jones.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just speaking as a member of the adoption panel at this time, and I'd just like to reiterate, you were saying, the process which it goes through. And the adoption panel is made up of a variety of people who've had experience of some form or another. They may be social workers, or they may be teachers, they may be adoptees, they may be adopters, but it's made up of a panel of people, and we have endless reports. I think Councillor Harris will back me up with foster caring. They are really in-depth reports which take hours to, an hour at least, but much more usually to read. So they're very complex, and they cover every aspect of potential parents of the children's lives. So we feel we get to know them. But not only that, people, the social workers come in front of our panel, along with the prospective parents who've already been through a process, and they are questioned in the panel. So it is a really kind of complex issue, and it isn't always successful. That's got to be said. There isn't always a happy ending, but it is for a reason. But it is a really detailed process.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, I think, again, the recommendation is simply that we note that report, but in so doing, yet again, I think I would say you have made us aware of some of the complexities with which you're dealing with this service, and we pass on our congratulations to you. It looks as if the service, from what you have said this afternoon, is up and running and doing well, and looking after, again, some of our more challenged young people and helping them to find a new family in which to go forward in their lives. So thank you very much indeed for coming down to speak to us this afternoon. We will be more than happy to send that forward now to Cabinet, and just simply to note with that we note that the service is successful and that there is good collaboration with our own people here working towards improving lives for people who need to move to a new family. So many thanks indeed.
Correct, thank you, Chair.
If we could move on then to agenda item 5, which is the partnership agreement between schools and governing bodies. I'd like to ask, is it Mr. McLean going? Right, okay. Over to Kath Saunders, who will kick off.
Thank you, Chair. As part of the consultation process that we're undertaking, we're bringing the agreement to members to offer a view on the statutory partnership agreement. It's a legal requirement within the 2002 Education Act that each local authority has a partnership agreement between itself and the school governing bodies. The purpose of the agreement is to provide a formal legal basis and make clear who has statutory responsibility and whether it's the school governing body, the local authority, or the school governing body delegating it down to the head teacher. The document is produced in line with Welsh Government regulations, and even though it's quite a heavy, weighty document, it follows the format which has been adopted by all the other local authorities in Wales. And by having this document, it's felt that it provides a firm basis for schools and the governing bodies to work together with the overall aim of raising standards.
Thank you very much. I would say that as chair of this committee and Miss Eilert as the scrutiny manager received from the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors representation regarding this. And as their chair, I'd like to ask Ms. Wakeley if she'd like to address the committee.
Thank you. I just wanted to say first that it's a good thing to have, and we need to have it, and it's going to be it sets out the expectations of schools and the local authority really, really well and in lots of detail. And I really appreciate the fact that it's gone from 71 pages to 48. That's a real benefit from the last time that we saw it. I've still got, from when the association saw it before, though, we talked about the detail in terms of the responsibilities outlined in their full governing bodies and the lack of accountability in there or acknowledgement of the professionals in the school, the head teacher and the senior leadership teams. And I think that still stands in terms of identifying those splits between responsibilities and accountabilities. In some areas, the document is very strategic, and so safeguarding, for instance, is a perfect example. It shows very clearly what the governing body is responsible for, and there aren't any operational things in there that are mentioned. It's only governing body responsibilities. In other areas, it's very operational, and there are things in there that governing bodies can't possibly be responsible for in detail, in operating them, or shouldn't be responsible for, because there are individual pupils, there's entering data on systems, there's things like that where governing bodies can't possibly ensure that they happen. They can delegate them if they wish to. They could ask the question of whether they've been done, but they can't actually be responsible for, unless they stand over somebody and check that it's being done, for actually ensuring that they've been done. So I think there's there's some areas in there where the detail is great because it will help us have expectations, proper expectations, but I think we need to be careful about who's responsible for what. Otherwise, we don't acknowledge the work of the professionals in the school or their accountability, and we potentially frighten off governors who go, oh my goodness, I don't want to be a governor, I don't want to be responsible for all of those things. Now in practice, with the way the relationships work between a local authority and schools, they aren't, but if you read the document, it looks like they are. And the relationship between local authority and schools is generally between the head teachers and senior leadership teams and the local authority. They're the people that meet, they're the people who you communicate with to say, to inform, to discuss, to consult, and that's as it should be, but that needs to be acknowledged in the agreement. So those relationships, the way that we actually work, should be reflected in that document. That's my view, and those are the sorts of views that I picked up when we talked about it in the association.
Ms Saunders, do you want to respond to individual points or get a few comments and perhaps respond having heard a few? Or well, could I bring in Councillor Powell at this point then?
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Kath. I think looking over the years, I've been governor for quite a number of years, and I went through, particularly, I declared my interest in being Governor of King Henry, but the relationship between the governors and the head teacher and the senior leadership team specifically, I think is very important. When I was first a governor there, the head teacher then was suffering from ill health, and I went there as a governor, and I felt that I don't know what I'm doing here because I don't seem to know what's going on actually on the ground floor, you know, in the school itself. And over the years, especially since we've had our new head teacher, Elspeth, things have changed. We have meetings where the senior leadership team brings reports of what's going on in each of the years, and not just with the exams and the GCSEs and that, but throughout the year. And this has made it far more easy for us to understand what's going on in the school. And at least once, if not twice a year, we have a session where some of the teachers as well and the governors, we have a workshop where we all put our ideas together. And this is making it far more easy for us to understand what's going on and for us to realise where our responsibilities lie and smooth the running all round. And I think this is one of the main things that we need to have. And I'm very pleased we have it. And I think it's good for the school in general. We also, I go in sometimes and listen to children's giving presentations, and also looking at pupils' books and things like that, and remarking upon them and seeing how things are going. And I think this is what being a governor is all about. But and it is that if we can all work together, the teachers, the officers, obviously from the council, and the governors in one, it's far better. With this report, I think, you know, basically it seems good, but I don't think it's finalised. I think there's a few things that need tweaking a bit and just giving it a little bit more time to because it's a big responsibility, and I hope that we can do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. The thing that concerns me about this report, that in some ways it takes away, and I declare an interest. I'm currently Governor of Ysgol Gymraeg y Fenni. I was Vice Chair there many years ago, and I was campaigned for the schools. I've been involved with the school for a long time. But I think the thing that concerns me, if I were a prospective governor, then, and I were not in education or not involved in that way, and you might be a parent, you might be in a particular job or role, but not in education, then I think this would be quite overfacing. You know, at the end of the day, in my sort of simplistic mind, the management of the school is a tripartite, really. It's the head teacher and senior leadership team, it's the local authority, and the governing body. But even if you are a teacher or a professional in education, it's not your responsibility to run the school, you know, or to be very sort of frontline responsible for some of the policies and particularly the implementation. At the end of the day, I've been on appointment panels. My point of view is, at the end of the day, it's the head teacher who has to work with that particular new member of staff, etc. Yes, I would advise and pass my opinion, but the final sort of decision would be the head teachers, and I think that pertains across a lot, you know, many decisions. And I just feel some concern, you know, for prospective governors who would probably do a very good job. They would be put off by this because they think, well, I haven't got the capability to do this. It is the head teacher and the senior leadership team, and obviously they are relatively well paid to do that job. And I think it sort of, I have a concern that it might detract from their responsibility and accountability, because at the end of the day, a parent would go to the head teacher with a major issue. They wouldn't go to a governor. They might at some point, but the head teacher is responsible day to day. So I think some of the points that we've sort of thought about, I think, are important in terms of how this policy works out, and I think it needs more consultation.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other points? Yes, Mr. Strong. Could you press your that's it, you're live now.
Yeah, pages 31, 32 on a paper document. I'm looking at it here from more from the staff angle than the children's angle, so I hope that's still appropriate. I'm a bit concerned that that schools or head teachers may be too willing to suspend staff when child protection issues are raised. The procedure is that the head teacher and the child protection officer, are often the same person, will carry out an investigation before deciding whether that should be referred to the strategy committee. No investigation?
Okay. No, actually, there should be no investigation. Once an allegation is made, it should be reported straight away.
Okay, well...
Any investigation is undertaken at the direction of the strategy meeting, and whether that be by the police, the social services, or the employer.
So who decides if it's a child protection issue?
That would be for the head teacher to decide.
All right,
and
okay.
She reports it. She reports it then to social services.
So the head teacher has to do a degree of investigation to determine whether it's a child protection issue.
No investigation.
Well,
the allegation. If an allegation is made, the head teacher has the duty and responsibility to report that allegation, not investigate as to whether it's right or not.
All right. But the head teacher has to decide if it's a child protection issue. Agreed? Okay. All right. Well, I'll rephrase what I'm saying then. I think head teachers are sometimes lacking the confidence to use their own judgment about whether an allegation is a child protection issue and whether it therefore needs referring to the strategy committee. Yeah? Because if it is referred, of course, then that teacher is more or less automatically suspended. Yeah, and sometimes that can take a very long time to deal with. I mean, there have been cases, recent cases in this county where staff have been suspended for something like 7 weeks before the strategy committee has decided that there's no, but they're not involved in any way. It's purely an in-school issue. Now, if that has to happen, that has to happen. But I anecdotally, I get the sense that sometimes it happens when it doesn't need to be happened. When it doesn't need to happen, things are referred to child protection that aren't really child protection. And I would like it sort of looked into as to see, is there a problem here? How many suspensions have we got? How many have resorted in the strategy committee deciding that there is no need for them to be involved? How long has it taken in each case? There are all sorts of issues here. Of course, although suspension is technically a neutral act, if you're on the end of it, you will understand it doesn't feel like that at all. You're left to stew at home for weeks on end, not even allowed to talk to your workmates, which might be the whole of your social circle gone. The class or classes that you're meant to be teaching no longer have their normal teacher. It's costing a fortune to employ supply teachers and so on. So I think that's an issue that we need to be sure that we're getting it right on. I'll put it no stronger than that.
Okay, thank you very much. We've had a range of points there. I was going to say if Ms Saunders or Mr McLean would like to just sort of generally respond at this point.
Thank you, Chair. If I just come back on those safeguarding comments before Kath picks up the comments on the document. One of the things which we really do benefit from is the relationship between our LOSI, as they're referred to, the local authority lead for safeguarding and education, and the schools themselves. So I know absolutely that all of our head teachers, without fail, will ring Heather to have a discussion about the incident or the referral or the allegation that's been made. It's obviously hugely important that we take care in the most kind of cautious way we can any allegation that's made of a professional nature. They then do escalate up into a process that is set down through the All Wales Child Protection schedules. So that process is determined by somewhere else. So we have to work through that process. It's absolutely right that the schools are very open and transparent with us, that we have those upfront conversations with them about the nature of the allegations and what they should do next. Clearly, it's not in anyone's interest to have members of staff suspended, particularly if there isn't a case to answer in the future. The recent judgment in Lambeth, which was again about the fact that actually suspension isn't a neutral act, means that we have to be hugely careful before we move to suspend a member of staff. And all of those things are considered by myself, the local authority, safeguarding unit, and HR working together. So it's not something that I would ever hope that a head teacher makes a decision on a whim about, or something that doesn't look into any allegation made by a child against a member of staff. It's so important that we follow those proper All Wales child protection processes properly and fully to make sure that everybody is safe. And I include in that all of the teachers, all of the teaching assistants, and everybody else who works in our schools.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Ms Saunders?
Thank you, Chair. Just to pick up on a few issues that were raised. Going back to the point that was raised by Monmouthshire Association of School Governors, we did include from the original document that came to MASC that we did put the responsibilities in consultation with the senior leadership team, and that was also on the recommendation of some head teachers. No other head teachers have commented that they wanted it defined further as to what their responsibilities are, because I think they're quite clear on what they have to report to the governing body. And looking at some of the comments that I did have back from Mr Fowler, when he's saying that he doesn't think that governors can monitor this, but governors should be monitoring some of the information via head teachers' reports, and is how the governing body should be challenging the head teachers. So we can define it further down if that's what is required. However, none of the head teachers have asked us for that, apart from putting in that this responsibility in conjunction with the senior leadership team.
I noted that you put that in, and I was grateful that the senior that they appear more fully now in the document. Absolutely, but actually, in some of those areas, you know, governors are told regularly when we go to training that we have a strategic role and that we have to input, approve, challenge. And be involved at a strategic level in directing the school. But we're also told very clearly that we should not interfere operationally in anything in the school. And there seems the wording in here seems to make it very blurred, those lines of responsibilities. In some of these instances, I can see that yeah, strategically it works in consultation with the head teacher. In other examples, it looks like it should be the other way round. So the head teacher in consultation with the governing body. So it looks to me like it's not consistent all the way through in terms of the levels of responsibility. And I think it's because the document intends to be very full and very clear with lots of detail, and it covers all of the relationship between the local authority and schools. And because of that, it's tried to make governing bodies responsible for everything when actually they're not.
What the document does is outline what the governing body's responsibilities are and what the local authority's responsibilities are, and coming back to
show what the head teacher's responsibilities are.
But those responsibilities are the governing body would delegate some responsibilities then down. The head teacher doesn't have their own responsibilities. They're accountable to the governing body, which goes back to
they have a job description and they're paid to do a job.
Sorry, Miss Wakely,
yes.
One person at a time. And I know that Mr McLean is trying to get in as well, but then I will come back to you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to be really clear, that this partnership agreement is drawn up on the basis of the Welsh Government's guidance. So that's the model that we've used to develop it. It is in no way different to any local authorities that sits across the EAS region, for instance. So colleagues from Newport have shared theirs. It's identical to the level of detail. I think there is something, which we need to explore more broadly with schools in Monmouthshire about really understanding the accountability where that sits. Because some of the commentary, and I understand entirely what Councillor Thomas meant in terms of that notion around, if you were to be an aspiring governor and to see this set out so clearly might be something which would actually put you off, and I understand that. It is, however, the law, and there is something inescapable about that, because it is the governing body who runs those schools. It is the head teacher who is employed to do that, in much the same way as the leader of this authority and the chief executive runs the organisation. And it's that kind of almost a kind of an non-exec split, but in the school setting. And it is the governing body who is accountable. We haven't tried to conflate different roles. We've been exactly the same as all other local authorities. And I think it's one of the things which we've seen when we've been to schools where that clarity hasn't necessarily existed between the governing body's understanding of their role and what other people who play a part in the school life is where those schools have found themselves in difficulty. This is a significant refresh of the document. I think it's the first time we've been through such a full process in Monmouthshire with our partnership agreement. So I can understand why, if it hasn't been in place as clearly as it should have been since the guidance was issued in 2008, that actually for governing bodies to look at it suddenly looks quite stark. But actually, those are the statutory obligations upon the school governing body and upon the local authority. And there will be times when my relationship and senior officers in the authority's relationship is directly with the head teachers around certain things. But there come other times when my relationship is very clearly with the governing body. And it's the governing body that I address certain letters to. For instance, if I were to have to issue a warning notice or invoke my powers, that is to the governing body, not to the head teacher. Quite clearly, that's that route in that sense. Head teacher obviously copied into those correspondence. Very infrequently we have to use them, thankfully. But I do think that there is potentially a piece of work for us to do to make sure that governing bodies really do understand the depth of their responsibility as governors. It's not something which people should take on lightly. And it does bring with it significant responsibility, and that is how it is. And I can show you the Vales, Blaenau Gwents, Newport. Any of those will have exactly the same detail, exactly the same level. In fact, I think we've tried acting on mass feedback to actually So it is a difficult one. And if it's something we need to do in more depth with our governing bodies, then that's something which, of course, we will do.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Are you happy that Ms Wakely, do you want to come back?
I still think I understand completely, and I understand the responsibilities of the governing body, but I still think it might be useful to have a look at some of the actual words used in terms of what governors do, because governors can input and challenge and question and support and encourage, but they don't usually set things, they don't develop things, they don't ensure things, they don't. Those are operational things, and I think maybe we can look at the language a little bit and see whether we can make it less, change the emphasis slightly.
I think, ensure is a really important one, because ensure is a word that is kind of recurrent in the document. And I actually really think that's an important part of the governing body's role. It's not to ensure by doing, but you really do need to ensure that the proper policies and processes are set in school and are followed. And that's a really important part to ensure that that is done properly. And if you were not to have that assurance by doing that work, then I would be concerned about how a governing body could give account for what happens in that school.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from committee members? I have one comment, and it's a kind I've made in other places as well about other reports, and that is that it really does need a good proofread, because it looks as if it could have been written by 3 or 4 different people. For example, governing body is alternately uppercase and lowercase. Head teacher is in some places 2 words, in other places it's 1 word. I could go on because I went through this document in some detail. I know that when it will be looked at by the Welsh Government and by Estyn, if it is not clearly the policy of the authority, and there is a suggestion that it's actually a document cobbled together by several different people, then we potentially could be in some difficulty. It seems to me that Councillor Powell made a very good suggestion in saying that it actually needed a bit more work doing on it. I would certainly concur with that. I think the nature of the comments that members of this committee have made this afternoon, we are far from happy with it in its current state. Having said that, from the chair, let me reiterate our senior officer's comment that as governing bodies, those of us who are governors have statutory duties. We are responsible in law for what happens in those areas in our schools. There is no escaping that. And governing bodies that do not fulfil those statutory responsibilities risk bringing the whole deck of cards around, the house of cards falling around them. That said, statute is also clear that our governing bodies need to establish very positive relationships with their local authorities. And I'm anxious here that there is a divide between the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors, who feel that they have not been properly consulted, and when they were consulted, their views not fully represented in the document we've got today. So, from the chair, I can see both sides in this argument, and I do take Councillor Powell's view that we could actually contribute something positive here. So, from the chair, and I will put this to a vote of committee, that the recommendation is that we establish a meeting of officers of the authority and representatives of the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors, because I've expressed an interest in looking at the document in a slightly different way from a purely grammatical point of view. Perhaps if I could chair bringing together those two sides, because the Association of Governors have accepted that the basis of the document is there, and there is a willingness to make it work, but it's not going to work at the moment. So could I propose then that I call a meeting of representatives of officers of the authority and of Monmouthshire Association of School Governors, that we go through this document and try to find a form of wording that is acceptable to the governing body side, while still making it very clear, Mr. McLean's point, that this is a statutory requirement that sets out statutory duties. Could I propose that that is the way forward? Those in favour? That seems to be the way that we will go. So if I could perhaps ask Mr. Williams, Democratic Services, if they could get the wheels in motion there to get a meeting organised, and then we can take this forward. Mr. Strong.
Yeah, if I could just raise a point before we move on from item 5. It has no bearing upon what has just been decided. An admin point, really. On page 42 of the paper version, page 80, I think, of the electronic version, the school budget forum, I note that there's one trade union representative place on that forum. Can I ask that it be checked that a trade union representative is actually attending regularly? Is that a yes, or just a yes that you'll check? Yeah. And in relation to that, if the procedure for election and re-election has been made clear, it's my impression, and I might be wrong, but the trade union rep was elected a long time ago, might not be attending anymore because they've retired from activity or whatever, and that no procedure has been made for filling that place. If that could be looked at, we'd be very grateful. It could be dealt with through meeting with trade union officers. Yeah.
Thank you for raising that, Mr. Strong. Officers will look into that for you, and we can get back. Any further comments from officers? Are you happy with my proposal for taking things forward? I would hate to fall out with officers at a meeting of our committee.
That's fine.
Okay, so that's the way forward. Thank you all very much for your comments on that one, and let's hope we can take that forward as a document which our governing bodies will value and sign up to with complete confidence. So moving on to our final item this afternoon, agenda item 6, which is to look at the school attainment outcomes at Key Stage 4. You remember we had a member seminar on this item when they were still the draft figures, but these are now the final verified outcomes. So, Mr. McLean.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to just put some additional information up on the screen, if that's okay, as I talk to the report, because members will have noticed that in the report itself, it's all done at a county level, whereas actually much of the information and the detail will be at a school level. So if I just put those up and I can begin to talk to that. There we are, grand. Okay, that probably looks quite busy on the screen. As the Chair has said, this is the formal reporting of our Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 performance for the end of the last academic year. So that's the 17-18 academic year. Just for members, we haven't been tardy in reporting this to you, but it takes an awfully long time for the statistics to be worked through fully following results day. And the final data set was released in the week before Christmas. So this was the earliest opportunity we have to get it to you. There has been quite a lot of scrutiny of some of these outcomes over the past few weeks. We had a meeting of the authorities' external reference group, which is a legacy of our Ministerial Improvement Board. That was on the 30th of November. We then had our termly visit from Estin on the 14th of December. So these have been worked through. So I will share with members 2 other papers, this set of slides so that members can see that, and a further paper that we provided to Estin that time didn't allow us to share with you through our normal paper distribution. The first thing I'd just like to draw your attention to is the bottom 3 paragraphs of page 1 of the report, which just sets out that accountability measures at Key Stage 4 are continuing to go through significant change. And on the screen, you'll be able to see the graph, and the big dashed line represents when there was a change in the collection methodology from one year to the next. So that's what that line there delineates. And I will try and pick those up as we go through the various pages. So if we go on to page 2, top of page 2, I mean, you can see this, and I will in no way try and shy away from this, but you can see that it has been last summer was a challenging set of outcomes for Monmouthshire. We saw our level 2 inclusive threshold measure fall by 7.5 percentage points, down from 67% to 59.5. That was a very disappointing outcome for us and for the 4 schools in Monmouthshire. We had expectations of a better set of outcomes, but various factors acted together to reduce the level to that 59.5. At the same time, you'll see that the Welsh position increased by 0.5% as well. So it's a challenging year. So the gap between us and the Welsh average closed significantly. And you can see there in that graph there that we are probably about 4th or 5th highest performing authority in Wales last year. And you can see just beneath that, it talks about performance against targets. All of our schools have very well developed tracking methodologies throughout the year. However, last year we found that there was a significant issue in the way that schools had tracked pupils through. And that did cause us to be significantly out in both our target setting and our progress towards. I suspect dancing around something which I should probably just come out and say. Last summer, there was a significant issue with regards to the grade boundaries of the English language examinations at GCSE level. I'm not a statistician, so I'll be careful what I say. The process which is used to ensure that each cohort has a fair hearing, I guess, in their exam diet, is called comparable outcomes. So that's what you look to. You look for comparable outcomes for each cohort as it moves through the education piece. Now, that means there will be some volatility and there will be some changes year on year in terms of how people achieve. This year for us, it looks as though English language has been a significant impact on the outcomes that we've achieved. If there's a significant impact on English, it has a significant impact on all of the threshold measures. The summer examination for English language required students to achieve a raw mark of 220 to achieve a C grade. If they had sat in an earlier sitting, there would have been a requirement to get, I think, 204 to achieve a C grade. So this was a grade boundary adjustment which was very significant. Now, all teachers would expect, and all schools would expect, there to be some variance in grade boundaries between sittings and between years. The magnitude of the jump from 204 to 220 was more significant than anybody had expected. And certainly when schools received their results on that Thursday, I had every single head teacher ring me to talk about English language. Now, we've also seen, because discussions with colleagues across Gwent, that there had been variability right across the region of the EAS. Some schools performed very well, and others didn't perform as well as they had expected. So there was no obvious trend. That didn't stop other parts of Wales making much more formal complaints about the outcomes that had been achieved in the summer. And colleagues in North Wales, in the Northern Consortia, which is at Gwer, actually lodged an official complaint with Quals Wales and with WJEC. That resulted in a very substantive, as you'd expect, investigation by those two bodies as to the summer's English language outcome, at which point they concluded that, that there hadn't been a statistical benefit to sitting the examination early, but, and I think, I can't remember the exact phraseology, but in some situations there might have been some impact. So I think on the whole, you know, the thing for us to do is actually take the results as they are. Clearly, it was something that was very much around in the months past August, between August and December, this concern around the outcomes, and it was one of the things which all 4 of our schools identified as contributing to their threshold measures in particular and their English outcome. I have to say the EAS were really supportive in that period of time. EAS had the chief executives of those 2 organisations, the WJ and Quals Wales, to a twilight session. All secondary head teachers were invited to attend that, so they did have that kind of very first-hand opportunity to go and question both the regulator and the examination board to understand what had happened. In future, I suspect some of this will become less impactful because we will move to a position whereby, because of the first examination attempt counts, we will see, I suspect, the majority of students entering once at the end of the 2-year period of their GCSEs. So we'll move to a position whereby far more students are sitting the examination once rather than doing early entries. So that was part of the very clear instruction given by the Cabinet Secretary, or Minister as they are again now, in terms of trying to reduce the number of early entries. So that's just part of the context, and you'll see why that's important as we go through. So in terms of the level 2 inclusive, this is actually what's on the board at the moment. I'm not sure how clear it is. The blue line is Monmouth Comprehensive. The grey line is the one beneath that is Chepstow. The kind of the ambery line next one down is King Henry. The green line below that is Monmouthshire, and the red line below that is Wales. And the amber line, which you can see beneath there, is Caldicot. Now, clearly people will be able to see quite clearly there that Caldicot had a significant fall in its level 2 plus in 2018. The challenge is that we've only got 4 schools, and if a school has a fall of about 18%, and it makes up a quarter of our cohort, then that has a really significant effect on the number that we achieve collectively. So you'll see this repeated for a number of reasons. Caldicot did have a very challenging summer last year, and you'll see that line off repeated in the next few sets of graphs. If we go on to the top of page 3, you'll see the different threshold measures on those graphs. And I've also got those on the big screen as well. So the one which is up currently is level 2 plus. This is level 2 threshold. So this is 5 good GCSEs. And again, you can see that significant drop there. The big difference where the dashed line is came about because they reduced the amount of equivalent qualifications to GCSE that could be counted in your threshold measure. So it went from being any number could be counted to only 40% of the measure could be an equivalent qualification, such as a BTEC. So that had a significant impact. So you can see the Welsh line drop then. You can see there more consistency in the Welsh line, which is the red line at the bottom, and you can see the Monmouthshire figure continuing to fall again into 2018. So at level 2, a concern. At level 1, our performance improved actually, and this was one of those areas where there had been significant concern from this committee, and I think rightly so, and identified in the Chief Officer's report as well, about the performance. Level 1 is 5 GCSEs of any grade, so A star to G. So this really kind of represents the inclusivity of your curriculum. This is the one which you want to kind of capture how well everybody is achieving. And this is a positive to see that improvement from 94.1 to 94.6. So a high level of performance, but again, there's significant variance in between the schools. And interestingly, if you look at the Caldecott line on that one, you can see that one actually improving last year from a position whereby it was below the Welsh average in the year before. So 2017, it was below the Welsh average to a position significantly above the Welsh average. We'll now go into some of the subjects specifically, and I think this one really highlights the point that that I was referring to at the outset. This is level 2 English. So English language is the English examination that counts. Well, actually, let me clarify that. It counted last year. Next year, it will be English literature or language again. So the volatility of the change in the accountability framework, or language. So literature or language last year, just language this year. So you can see there that all of the schools in Monmouthshire did experience that significant drop. But again, you can see the most significant drop was in Caldecott. But as I say, all of those schools. It's interesting. It's a really interesting one for us to try and understand, because the first year of the new examinations, 2017, our schools were amongst the highest performing in all of Wales in terms of English language. And so my thought and my aspiration and my hope had been that they'd work through the English language examinations. They were confident with what they were teaching and how they were teaching that. They had obviously one sit, so they understood what that looked like, because obviously the year before, lots of the narrative was around people not having had an opportunity to sit early or to understand where the grade boundaries and so on would be. So we've seen this significant decline in terms of the English position, and that's mirrored in the papers that have been provided to you. Science is slightly different. There's a dotted line between 17 and 18. There should probably be another dotted line between 16 and 17. This is preparing us for the position in 2018 whereby science BTEC qualifications did not count anymore. So the only examinations that counted in 2018 were science GCSEs. A significant number of schools used the BTEC route to support their learners who probably wouldn't achieve the traditional 3 sciences, and they used a kind of a more blended BTEC science qualification, and that pushed their numbers up. So you can see everybody significantly falling away there. 2017, people were beginning to bring the GCSE only route in to make sure that they were prepared for 2018, but you can really see that fall away from 2016. The other one, just to comment on, which is in your pack, the bottom right quadrant of the 4 on page 4, the 4 graphs on page 4, is our 5 A-star A grades. Now, there has been a fall in that from 24.4% to 24%. Clearly, it's disappointing to see it reduce, but I think it's still really worth identifying that as an area of real strength in Monmouthshire. So that's just about a quarter of all of the children in Monmouthshire are achieving 5 A-star or A grades. So that's a very, very significant outcome. If we had the similar slides for that, you would see that in King Henry, that number is just about 33%, which is an outstanding outcome for any individual school, nearly a third of children achieving 5 A-star or A's. As we move on through the, I'll just finish off these last 2 slides. This is much more consistency, again, apart from Caldecott, which you can see reducing there. Much more consistency around the maths and the numeracy, and that's the benefit that we'll probably see next year of the literature or language of having the 2 kind of aspects to the maths. So maths and numeracy, or pure maths as it were, are the 2 different variables there, and you can see that consistency. And the final one is the CAP 9. So this will become the basis for the accountability framework in the future. And you can see there much more level outcomes. You can see Monmouthshire has declined a little bit, but much more variability. So you see Chepstow going up. King Henry, a very, very strong year performance in terms of its CAP 9. That's virtually, it's not solely down to the fact, but it's significantly supported by the fact that they achieved so many A's in terms of their cohort. So they had such a high number of children achieving 5 A-star A's that really does lift the average right up. You can see the Welsh average there holding level, and Wales and Monmouthshire moving slightly closer to that. If we move on to page 5 of the report in front of you, you'll see that we begin to move into some of the more detailed analysis, the first of which is the gender difference. Positively, the gender gap in Monmouthshire was smaller than the Welsh gender gap, which is positive. However, disappointingly, as opposed to last year, Monmouthshire boys are no longer outperforming the Welsh girl average, which is a kind of the marker which I think we should be looking for. That sounds, if that sounds slightly odd, sorry, apologies for that, but that's what I kind of normally look for, that Monmouthshire boys are performing better than the Welsh girls' position. So, and you can see there's been volatility through that over the past years as well. So 13-14, they're just about the same. And then 14-15, they moved above the Welsh girls' position, then they were below it the next year, back above it, and now they're below it again. So we have seen volatility in that over the past period. Moving on to page 6, I mean, this is one of those kind of very significant issues. Members will be well aware that it's an area of significant concern for myself, senior officers, and the EAS, and it's an issue that has been well discussed here and, of course, in full council, and that's with regards to the differential in performance between the cohorts who are eligible for free school meals and those who are not eligible for free school meals. You'll see the gap this year in Monmouthshire has widened again. That's despite significant attempts to make sure that that gap had closed. I think one of the things which we need to kind of begin to do is to really understand the vulnerability of the pupils within that cohort. The cohort last year was 78 pupils were eligible for free school meals against the whole cohort of 772. So it is just over 10%. So there are very few children in each of the cohorts. That inevitably, when you're looking at the statistics, means that there will be volatility from year to year. However, that said, it does mean that we know who the children are, we know what their challenges are, and we should be able to put support in place to ensure that they achieve the best that they can. One of the things which was very interesting, after the results in August, we had all 4 of the secondary schools into County Hall for what are perhaps a little dramatically called summit meetings. Those meetings involve the head teacher, the chair of governors, interestingly, at that stage. And at that point in time, the EAS, the executive member, myself, and other senior officers talk to the schools about what happened in the summer, where they've identified key areas of concern and so on. FSM is one area that we talk about all the time. That's an absolutely fundamental one for us. What was really interesting this year was actually to go through, because the numbers can be very low. Last year or the year before last, it was as few as 10 in King Henry. You can go through those children on a one-by-one basis and understand what other challenges they've had through the year that might have impacted on their ability to achieve their GCSE outcomes. And certainly this year, through the process we're working through with Caldecott at the moment, we've been looking at how they've targeted pupils for outcomes who are both FSM and non-FSM, and actually to listen to that kind of case study-based evidence of those FSM cohort. It was very concerning, I guess, on the one hand, to hear the significant number of children in the school and in that cohort who had such significant challenges outside of school as well, and how that impacted on the likelihood of them achieving. So it's not going to be an easy switch. There's nothing we can do kind of overnight. Obviously, these children are sitting this examination in year 11. By virtue of that fact, they've had 11 years of education, and we've had 11 years of trying to get it right with them. So late interventions with these children don't necessarily always bring a silver bullet, so you're looking to really work as much as early as we can. But we have commissioned some work through the EAS with Professor David Egan to look at understanding if there are any specific aspects around rural deprivation and small numbers of FSM children in schools that impact on them achieving what we want them to achieve. There has been some evidence cited, and we held an event in King Henry at the end of our Wellbeing Week, and Cardiff University were talking at that event around actually it's much more difficult if you are part of a very small FSM cohort to achieve rather than being part of a much bigger FSM cohort. So that type of information we're kind of drawing through now. Obviously, if you have very small numbers of FSM children, there is a proportionately smaller amount of money you receive through the pupil deprivation grants, or pupil development grants, sorry. And that obviously does impact on your ability to spend and develop specific interventions for those young people. We're developing some work based around the Education Endowment Foundation's work, looking at the top 15 interventions for children, but they're over the life course of an education as opposed to just looking at years 10 and 11, and that's where we have to really focus. So it's an area that will clearly come under greater scrutiny this year. I will be reporting to full council my Chief Officer's report, and I would fully expect councillors to question me significantly on those outcomes and what we look to achieve in the future. Just moving on to page 7, and this reports out much of what I've already talked about. You'll see at the top of that page the authorities' rankings. You can see there that across the board we're in lower positions other than the threshold for the level 1 than we were last year. I think it's incumbent upon us, and having just worked through the target setting process with all of the schools, I don't expect to see us at that position again next year, but we've really got to work very closely with the schools to make sure that we're accurate in our predictions and our targets for next year. And then the next section really picks up the individual schools, as we have done on the graphs, but what it does this time is colour codes them into their quartile. So the darker green is quartile 1, lighter green is quartile 2, but above the Welsh median. The amber colour is below the median, but not in the bottom quartile, and red is obviously the bottom quartile. So you can see there, despite the fact we've dropped such a significant amount, 3 of the schools are still in above the median, and only 1 is in the top quartile, but 2 are in the second quartile for their performance. A couple of interesting things to note, I guess. It does show the extent of the impact of Caldecott's outcomes to pull us down by as many as 7.5%, but also that how well Chepstow did to remain in the top quartile given the year that they had last year in terms of the industrial disputes and so on in school. So I think that should be recognised. You can see there again, level 2 is the problematic one for us as opposed to level 1, which it was the year before. And as we go through those, I won't go through them all because they're all there for you. And you can see again at the top of page 8, that picks up the information in a slightly different format. So you can see the trend over time of where the quartile positions are for our schools. The final point is the section around Welsh Government modelled expectations. The way this is calculated is that Welsh Government commissioned an organisation called Fisher Family Trust to provide them with some statistical analysis which allows them to make or to set an expectation for children's progress from the end of Key Stage 2 to the end of Key Stage 4. If we can put the screen back on again in a second, I'll show you a couple of Fisher Family Trust data sets which you can see how that works through. But you can see there that in terms of expected outcomes, all of the schools were below their modelled expectation. Caldecott significantly, and the closest was Monmouth. Monmouth at 2.1% is probably within the realms of tolerance in terms of statisticals. The rest of them would be significantly outside of those. There are some key kind of issues around the statistics and how they're used. It was with the match cohort only, so it's only with those pupils who make the transition from our schools or Welsh schools into a Welsh secondary school. So some of our schools are more impacted by cross-border impact, but it is clearly an area that we have to focus on. So if I just hope if people bear with me just a second. So this is the detail that comes from the Fisher Family Trust. This is now called Aspire, and this is available to everybody. Not quite sure why that's not out there. Hang on a second. Oh, there we are. Excellent. So this is available to everyone. So the first set of data they use, if we look at the bottom right of this screen, this is the value added. So this is achievement is compared with similar pupils nationally. The FFT, Fisher Family Trust, value added model uses prior attainment, a pupil's gender and their month of birth as the starting point. So you're going to be compared with, a child in a Monmouthshire school at the end of Key Stage 2 will be modelled their progress against a child who is of the same sex, or the same gender, born in the same month, who got that as well, who got whatever that achievement was. So if you achieved level 4, the expected level, or a boy born in September, you'll be compared with all the boys born in September who achieved level 4. So you can see here that using that simple overlay, actually the green plus sign means that it's statistically significant, but it does show progress. So attainment is actual results, and you can see there that we're significantly above the Welsh average for the CAP 9, and you can see that we're significantly above the average for the level 2 threshold, although there's a downward arrow then which shows that our trend is not as progressing as well as we would have hoped. On the progress, so this is adding value to a pupil's journey through their education, you can see that we made progress with regards to the CAP 9, but we didn't make statistically significant progress with regards to the level 2 threshold. And it's much closer to being in line with the national average. What it then goes on to show is that, and again, you're looking for the green plus, you can see that 3 of our schools in terms of attainment were higher performing, King Henry, Chepstow and Monmouth. Caldecott, higher performing because it's probably above the Welsh average, but not higher performing statistically so. And then overall achievement, it's only King Henry that's statistically significant. However, the real test for schools and for local authorities is to use a second dashboard. Now, this is the CVA, so this one is much more contextually sophisticated. So looking at the bottom right there, the FFT CVA model uses prior attainment, gender, month of birth, but then it adds on comparison to children who are FSM, to those who come from a specific ethnic group, those who have a special educational needs status, those who have English as an acquired language, and mobility. And mobility is whether you move schools in years 10 or 11. So suddenly, not just comparing you to a similar boy who was born in September and achieved a level 4 outcome, we're now comparing you to, if I carry on this one, so it would be a boy who is born in September, who is not eligible for free school meals, who is white British, who doesn't have any special educational needs. English is their first language, and they've been in the school since year 7. And suddenly, you can see then that's a much better matching profile through. And interestingly, when we take it here, you can see again that in the actual results, which is attainment, we're statistically better again. However, in the progress elements, we don't do as well. So we're actually in line with the national average, actually 3.6% points beneath on the CAP 9, but you can see we're much further below, significantly below, on the level 2 inclusive. And you can see there that for the first time, in terms of achievement, we've got 2 schools there who are lower performing, Monmouth Comp and Caldecott. And that's on the progress. So what we're saying there is that children who went into Monmouth or Caldecott last year, and it always feels slightly invidious kind of giving this feedback because you are naming specific schools, and I know people have associations with those schools, but children who are compared to their closest statistical neighbour that we have the evidence to do, don't make as much progress in those 2 schools as they do in other schools. And that's quite telling for us in terms of how we do that. There's a huge amount of data in this, and I can make these handouts available to committee members if they would like to see it in that detail. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. So you can see there, it goes through different pupil groups and so on. So that's a really helpful and accessible way, and that will feature as part of the Chief Officer's report as well. Thanks, Richard. Okay. So if we look then again at the back to the report, the last part to report on is Key Stage 5. That's A-levels. We've reported on this previously to this committee and to the full members seminar. You can see there that we improved our position in terms of the level 3 threshold. The level 3 threshold is not a particularly demanding threshold. The level 3 threshold is simply 2 A-levels, A star to E. So it's not, this year we'll see the introduction of a new accountability framework for A-levels, which will take into account progress, completion and destination. You can see there that we've made progress on 2017. It's a difficult one with Key Stage 5 because obviously people have selected to stay on in school, they've selected to study, they've also determined how hard they work to a far greater extent than they do at Key Stage 4. The other thing we experienced this year when we talked to schools about Key Stage 5 outcomes was that there was a definite impact in year of universities making unconditional offers to students. And that definitely saw students take their foot off the gas partway through their A-levels because they knew that they had the opportunity to go to the university they'd applied to, irrespective of what they achieved. Interestingly, now we're seeing some universities stopping that process in terms of how they're doing that. So that concludes that report at the bottom of page 9. You'll see in the Appendix A, that goes through all of the outcomes by school on the key measures and puts their quartile performance. In conclusion, I would say it was a challenging year. I think there are some things in nearly every school that they can be very pleased with, but there was too much variability across the schools. Clearly, the headline levels, we fell short of where we have been in the past, and that's disappointing. And clearly, the FSM cohort continued to be a significant concern to us and an area of work as we go forward. I'm sure there'll be questions, so I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Committee, questions, comments? Ms Wakely.
I just wanted to ask about the BTEC qualifications not being counted. Does that mean that schools will be put off offering them in future because they won't be counted in their data? Because it's an inclusive issue.
They will still be counted, but only 40%. So only 40% of your basket of qualifications you need to achieve to get to the thresholds can be a BTEC qualification. So we don't expect schools to stop doing them, and we do see them. No, not at all. In fact, interestingly, though, at the advanced level, at A-level, we did see some absolutely exceptional performances in our schools at A-level. And the equivalent to the FFT data I've just shared with you for Key Stage 4 is a product called ALPS, A-level Performance Systems. And our schools were amongst the very highest performing in all of the UK in some of those. And in fact, Monmouth Comprehensive has been selected to be the lead ALPS school for all of Wales in terms of its performance at A-level. However, what it did show was that pupils who were sitting BTECs weren't challenged as much. So they didn't make as much progress, children who are studying BTECs in our schools, as those who are doing A-levels. So that's something for us to work with the schools on, because our expectation should be whatever qualification you're seeking to achieve, the expectation on our children is exactly the same, that they achieve their very best. So that was a good indicator on that. But no, we're working with the schools to make sure that they can continue to offer a broad curriculum to all of their students.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Thomas.
Thanks for that very detailed report. I do know from attending other meetings linked with North Wales that North Wales schools are incredibly unhappy with the English results, and obviously took it to the Curriculum Authority and to WJC. Point I would make is in terms of free school meals, obviously disappointment that they continue to sort of lag behind, but in a sense it's understandable in one way. And as well, I think we've got to take note that the whole nature of exams now has changed and it's moved almost totally away from any school-based assessment, which probably, I don't want to use the word advantage, but it allowed children, probably from coming free school meal children, to attain some marks in that area, whereas now it's all on to do or die, isn't it, in terms of exams. And for children coming from, say, for example, a professional middle-class background with strong support when they get home and strong support running into the exam in terms of helping them to organise themselves and support them while they revise in what is, to be fair, an incredibly intensive period of time for any youngster. But if you're in a background which is not so stable, perhaps is not as supportive and obviously has issues in terms of finance and money, then that is going to affect that outcome. And I personally, I think it's a very difficult challenge, but it's something we really need to look at, is how do we support these youngsters in what is very much a new context and which is a very harsh context. And if you looked at the news recently, some of the independent schools have been using international GCSEs which don't really match the current level of demand of the new GCSEs, and hence, you know, some of their results are obviously going up, whereas for school children in a maintained school context in Wales, they have to do GCSE, and GCSE now is much more demanding. And it is really affecting free school meals youngsters, and I do worry about that.
I think that's a very fair point by Councillor Thomas. It is inevitably the case no, inevitable is the wrong word entirely. It is the case that when you move to a 2-year linear examination, so 2 years of study, examination at the end, there is an awful lot riding on those last couple of days of examinations for those papers. And in the past, I think when we had classroom-based assessment and coursework, it was much easier for schools to support people to make sure that they had the opportunity to do their work, they were given the right conditions and everything, and it is very much a concern. I still think there's something that we need to understand about what happens. If we look at the trajectory of our FSM cohort from foundation through to Key Stage 4, what we find is that the gap is about 10% at foundation phase, and yet clearly you can see it's 47.9% by the time it got to Key Stage 4. So something significant happens. That might be because, you know, in some of our schools we might only have 1 or 2 children with FSM, and that means actually that they're just, you know, part of the cohort, and all of that kind of works through, and something clearly happens on that transition from year 6 into year 7, so Key Stage 3, it begins to widen, and then Key Stage 4, we're at this position. So we've got to understand, and I think it's probably something which is not only a school-based, but an education-based, not only school and education, but a multi-agency response to think about what else we can do outside of school to support them, because I think that's the part. I think the support they receive in school is still significant in terms of additional work, in terms of mentors, and in terms of achievement leads and so on. But actually, what is it that they don't have that other children do that makes it more easy? You know, being told to go to bed at a reasonable time, you know, make sure you get your sleep, make sure you are organised. And you said those are all really important things when you're going into those kind of very difficult periods of examinations. So there's much more we need to do, and we'll continue to work with our schools to do that.
Councillor Powell.
Thank you. I'm really disappointed that they sort of sideline the BTEC, because children that aren't particularly academically inclined, they could take a BTEC exam, they'd achieve something, and this would give them their self-respect, if nothing else. And I think it's a very bad move, because we can't have people, a nation full of doctors and scientists and everything else. We need the carpenters, the plumbers, the electricians, and I think that we need to, you try and get hold of one, and it's, you know, I think with the BTEC, they could take these other exams and get a qualification of some sort, which would help them, and it gave them their self-respect. And I don't know where it's coming from. I think it's going down the wrong road myself.
I think we haven't removed BTECs. So to be
No.
really, so our children who want to study, who have a need to study at that level, are still more than able to in our schools, and that's really, really important. What's happened is that there's been a change in the way the accountability framework has been developed. So you can see that for everybody on that one graph, all of Wales at the level 2 has dropped.
Yes.
Because schools, there's a balance to be found between schools using an ability to use examinations or qualifications rather to prop up their outcomes as well. So I think some of it's around people trying to create a proper level playing field. So for instance, the removal of early entries, that's another one of those things that's been done to do that. BTEC science, is quite evident when you looked at that graph, what happens when you remove BTEC science. So they're trying to say there's a core science piece, which is around GCSEs, and that stops that and that prompts that fall away. So we continue to work very closely with our schools to make sure that they are providing all of our learners with the opportunity to follow a curriculum that meets their needs. Now, one of the things which I guess us as the local authority and you as members of this committee and as members of council obviously will have to do is to make sure that we're meeting the aims and objectives of the national mission. So we're complying properly with the rights accountability frameworks and so on, but actually that we can maintain the breadth of offer for our children. Because what you don't want to do is to find ourselves making an offer which would be detrimental to those children who are capable of getting five good GCSEs. So that's the balance we're always striving to find.
Because when I was first elected, it was 10, 11 years ago now, I've been on this committee the whole time, we did a working party, there's 3 or 4 of us, because that year all the secondary schools in Monmouth were doing badly at Key Stage 4. And we were given the task of finding out why. And all sorts of things, the red herrings, a lot of them. Because the other schools were taking them like out of county, taking them away, some of these other schools. But then if that was the case, we wouldn't have been top in Wales in Key Stage 2 or 3 either, because, it's that stage, 11-year-olds when they change. Perhaps it was the teaching, but you couldn't have bad teachers in all 4 schools. And it was the same in all 4 schools. And the one thing that we went to visit other counties, Veda Glamorgan and Powys and all these others, to have a look at what they were doing. And the only thing I could come up with, and it was the fact that when you put them all in the pot together, the children that aren't able to achieve GCSEs in any way were being pushed through to do it all at the same time. And they weren't recognising that they weren't academically inclined until they put them in for that exam. And it was too late then. And of course, they were pulling the final score down. And it was then we were pushing them then to give them more of a chance. That's when the BTECs were quite to study things at which they could and recognise, not in that stage, to recognise as soon as they went to secondary school in that first, if not second year, the first if possible, but second year, the children that aren't going to achieve academically and guide them down the practical side so that not only will they achieve something which they can do to get a good job and get their self-respect, but also by taking them out of the equation, then the overall result for the school is better. And, it started to go that way, and I'd hate to see it stop.
I think the one thing I would just say is that in terms of that kind of golden measure of level 2 inclusive, in the last 4 years, we've been the highest performing authority for 3 of those 4 years. And so there's clearly been a significant drop this year, but in those 3 of those 4 years, over 2/3 of children have got 5 good GCSEs, including English and Maths. So the evidence to suggest that we are not meeting the needs of the majority of our cohort wouldn't be borne out by that. I think what's important is that we do maintain that breadth and not be directed by what the accountability framework is.
Thanks.
Councillor Thomas.
Thanks, Chair. Just a really quick question. do we in any way track the youngsters who go, for example, through Welsh Medium and go to Ysgol Gyfun Gwynlliw, and also the children who go through the Catholic system and go to St Albans, because obviously they've received their primary education in Monmouthshire, but and we look at the four comps, etc. And I know those two schools are in another authority, but obviously they are Monmouthshire children. Certainly, you know, my kids went through that system, so did David Jones's kids go through that system, went to Gwynlliw, and in a way, that is then, you know, ignored, and they are in a maintained system. We don't have a Welsh medium school in Monmouthshire. We don't have a Catholic maintained school in Monmouthshire. So, but do we just sort of abandon their results in a sense?
We certainly don't. Well, yeah, we don't certainly abandon them. I'd like to, yeah, but we don't know. There is no way of us capturing those outcomes to bring back into ours, because it's done at a school level. It's whichever authority the school is. It would be the same for the children who choose to go to Crickhowell, children who go to Wydene. One of the interesting things is, and I don't have the latest version on my computer at the moment, but they match the cohorts through. So you remember I was saying about this, the level 2, the expected outcome is matched from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 4. Ours is the lowest matched cohort. In the past, it's been kind of 85%, and most other authorities would be 90, high 90s in terms of the matching through. So that does have an impact for us. So it's not necessarily the same group of children at Key Stage 4 as it was at the end of Key Stage 2.
Yeah.
Councillor Jones.
Just to partly answer Councillor Thomas's question, the schools in Torfaen don't look particularly good on the league tables, do they really? But I'll leave that thought with you.
Thank you for those words of wisdom and analysis there, Councillor Jones. Any other comments? I'd just like to come back, if I could, very briefly to the boys' free school meals issue again. Because it's sad to note that there's been a decline over 4 consecutive years. And I too raised this issue of our secondary schools with very small numbers of free school meals pupils, and that research that EAS have commissioned that David Egan is producing for us. And I think it's great that they're as responsive as that to our situation. You mentioned one particular issue of very small numbers feeling almost intimidated by being surrounded by youngsters from more affluent backgrounds and so on. Now, I think that I may have got this wrong, I may have heard it elsewhere, but my recollection, talking to the managing director of EAS, was that another emerging finding of David Egan was that one problem seems to be, and I'm not sure how they actually tabulate this, but it seems to be that there is an issue around the language of teaching. And the teachers, to put it bluntly, talk almost a different language to the free school meal children who are not gaining their success. And even more bluntly, teachers are middle class, and these kids aren't middle class. Now, if that does emerge as a concrete issue, that poses some very fundamental issues about the way we teach our teenagers, doesn't it?
You're right to cite that, Chair. That's one of the things which has been offered, that sometimes there can be a middle-class bias, is how it's referred to, in terms of the teaching particularly in secondary school. That would be something that we'd have to it'd be very difficult, because you'd be looking at how you understood people's own personal bias and how that works in a very kind of clear way, and having to make sure that people's, well, I think in all of our schools, and I think the emergence of things like the new Excellence in Teaching and Leadership Framework help us structure and think about pedagogy and professional development in a more systematic way. And I think if we're seeing really effective pedagogy in the classroom, then that should be and has to be something that everybody is able to access, not simply those who have been, made to read since they were, before preschool and all of those kind of things. Actually, you need something, a teacher, you know, one of the things which if Sharon was here with us today, she'd be talking about always looking for 3 levels of differentiation in the classroom. And it's that type of thing. And you're saying where your language should moderate in a way that means that it's accessible and challenging and stretching to the most able, but also accessible and understandable to those who aren't as able. So that's a key point, yes.
Just to sum this up then, if I could thank Mr McLean for bringing that report. He has not tried to hide the difficult statistics. Certainly there are things that we should be proud of. The percentage getting the 5A to G really does show that our secondary schools are addressing the needs of a very wide-ranging group of young people. On the other hand, there are issues that I know we need to continue to address. And Mr McLean alluded to the fact that that's already going on, in the fact that when he has his summit meetings, schools are able to talk about the performance of individual pupils. And I think that is so important, isn't it? Being able to challenge at an individual level to help our youngsters to maximise their performance. We're not there yet, and clearly there is work to be done. But the fact is that Mr McLean is able to demonstrate that the authority is going down that route. And I know that from the school where I'm a governor, already this year, the school is able to produce its initial data from the first term that shows improvement on those areas of weakness last year. I know we've talked about up and down with small cohorts and only 4 schools. But nonetheless, I think the authority is ensuring its schools hold themselves to account and is working with them to ensure that what this data is showing is actually taken to heart. So I think the only recommendation coming out of this committee this afternoon is that the report goes forward to Cabinet, that we do not shy away from the areas of weakness. And certainly when you compare the league tables from the Welsh authorities and you look at Key Stage, Foundation Stage and Key Stage 2, then Monmouthshire remains at the top on virtually all the measures, or first or second. And when we look at our comparative authorities, we're there or thereabout with those authorities. When we look at these Key Stage 4 figures, we are well below the comparative authorities. So something is still happening in our secondary schools. I know the authority is working hard, EAS is working hard to identify that, and the proof, of course, comes next summer when we go through the same process again for this current cohort's outcomes. But, Mr McLean, thank you very much for that, and thank you for the work you've done going right back to the summer in terms of the seminar for all members and so on. I know that these have not always been easy figures for you to bring to us, but next summer I am confident we will see better. So thank you very much indeed. Members, I have one little item. This is not for minuting, but at our last full committee, you remember that I was asked to write to the Secretary of State for Education to talk about the work of our Abergavenny schools and the Ethnic Minority Support Service in terms of the excellence of their provision for refugee children. I've had a response actually signed by Kirsty Williams thanking the committee for that and saying that she'll certainly bear that in mind. We raised the point about more time for youngsters sitting GCSEs and other exams, and she said we should refer that to the curriculum organisations, and I'll happily to follow that one through with them. I'll report that formally at the next full meeting of this committee because it'll be a matter arising, but I thought you might like to know that Kirsty Williams has acknowledged that we do have excellent practice here in Monmouthshire. The only other thing is to remind members that our next full meeting is at 10 o'clock on Thursday the 24th of January, and to thank you all for attending this afternoon. And my voice has just about held up, but I don't think it will for much longer. So I'll close the meeting now while the going is good.